Yeah, so I'm Lydia, and this research is from my doctoral thesis that I've just done at Massey. So my work was funded by the New Zealand Merino's PGP for strong wool and co-funded by Callaghan Innovation. And it was looking at using a bioeconomic system dynamics model to model the breed transition period from purebred Romney and using Merino sires to produce a crossbred flock with wool with a lower fibre diameter that gets higher prices, so improving wool income and hopefully farm income. The first part of the research I'm presenting today is already published in Small Ruminant Research, and the second part is just done one set of reviewers' comments back, which were good, so hopefully it'll be up soon as well. Cool, so my base farm that I was looking at doing a breed transition on was a North Island hill country farm, so that's class 4, and I was using the Beef and Lamb New Zealand Economic Service farm survey data averages from the 2017-18 production year. So it's over 500 hectares, 2,500 ewes, including 1-year-olds, with a lambing rate of 132% and producing coarse wool and lambs for sale. So that wool had a fibre diameter averaging, I assumed, around 36 microns. And this farm has both sheep and beef enterprises, and I was focusing on the sheep enterprise, which is 60% of stock units or 60% of total farm feed that the sheep are consuming. So this is the prices that I used in my model for wool for each fibre diameter, and this is on a greasy basis that farmers would get, so it includes discounts for skirtings. So you can see our base Romney flock is at the lower end of price, so the price that farmers are getting in that year was just over $2 per kilogram. Then of course the Merino farmers are getting towards the upper end of the prices that there are for wool with the lower fibre diameter wool. The data I found on Merino Romney crossbred suggests that a offspring of these breeds would have an average wool fibre diameter similar to their parental average. And then a second cross, which is the one I'm looking at transitioning to, would be around 22 to 26 microns. So that is potentially a significant lift in wool income through lowering fibre diameter. So I'm assuming that the Merino size I'm using have a average wool fibre diameter of 21 microns, and I'm aiming for that second cross 3/4 Merino sheep. In order to estimate the production of these Merino crosses, I had recent production data for Romney animals, and then I had experimental data that has direct comparisons of the breeds, and I found the Merino crosses had lower fleece weight, mature live weight, weaning weight, and lamb growth rates. There was insufficient data or no clear increase or decrease in production for birth weight, carcass dressing rate, and fleece yield. And then there was not enough data on their reproductive performance to inform my production parameters, so I varied this in different scenarios. And I was aiming for my second cross flock to be self-replacing once it had reached an equivalent size to the Romney flock. So it had effectively replaced that base Romney flock. So my scenarios, as I said, varying lambing rate, so either keeping it consistent with that original Romney lambing rate of 132%, or lowering it with increasing Merino genetics in accordance with current Merino versus Romney lambing rates achieved in New Zealand. And then I also varied the selection intensity of crossbred ewe lambs. So at 2 selection events each year for each cohort of crossbred offspring, I selected the ewe lambs at weaning. So the ones that weren't retained over winter were sold alongside ram lambs, either store or prime. And then there was another selection event at 10 months of age when their wool was able to be tested. And that's when I was applying my selection intensity for wool fibre diameter. So keeping the lambs with the finest wool. With my low selection intensity I modelled, there were overall annually to each cohort of ewe lambs 58% retained, and retaining fewer with my higher selection intensity. The model I use, this is just a screenshot of the component modules in it, is based around breeding ewes. You'll see at the top there the purebred flock, that's the Romney flock, then the first cross and the second cross, which was my final desired cross, 3/4 Merino. Estimated their feed demand, their wool production. There was a feed balance component module and an economic module that the other modules fed into. And then I was estimating cash operating surplus as my profit indicator each year during, pre, during and post the transition period. So now I'm on to my results. So my 3/4 Merino flock, once I'd reached that desired size equivalent to the base Romney flock, they had a fibre diameter of 26 microns with the low selection intensity and 24 microns with the high selection intensity. And this equated to a $1.79 kilogram difference in that wool value. And I was achieving that size that I wanted with more ewes than the base Romney flock, which you remember was 2,500, because per ewe they had lower live weights and lower production. So I could run a few more of them with the same feed demand. And with the low selection intensity, it took 7 years to achieve that final second cross flock. With the high selection intensity, it took 10 years. So therefore, the transition was finished after that many years of crossbreeding. Now, this is their feed demand during transition as a proportion of farm feed. You'll see the Romney feed demand is the blue line, was 60%. And then during transition, particularly where there was the lower selection intensity, the feed demand did rise for sheep to be consuming a significantly larger proportion of total farm feed. So the remaining proportion above what they're producing is what would be consumed by beef cattle, which, as you can see, is being reduced to below 20% during the low selection intensity scenarios. This was partially because of those ewe lambs needing to be kept over winter, but also because you were building up those crossbred ewe flocks sooner into higher numbers during transition with the lower selection intensity. And those arrows there show where you'd reached that desired size of your second cross Merino flock, so your final cross. But I've modelled out to 30 years because there were still fluctuations in the numbers of ewes in each age class of the flock until that point, which had implications for production, feed demand and profit. And then looking at their annual operating profit, this is just for the sheep enterprise. Again, that base Romney level of just under $400 per hectare is represented by the blue line. And as you can see, with the low selection intensity, you are having large reductions in cash operating surplus during transition, so up to where those wee arrows are pointing to on the x-axis. So although you're getting higher operating profit after transition, you are making losses during it. And the peaks in cash operating surplus there are due to selling off either Romney, those first peaks, or your half-bred ewe flocks. So when you're culling those to only then have your second cross ewes present on farm. Now to summarise the peak and changes in annual operating profit during and after transition, I've done a net present value analysis, and this is with 2 different discount rates and either 12 years just focusing on the transition period or 30 years, including that time where you had the higher profit after transition. So the status quo base Romney net present values are on the top row, and I'll briefly discuss the highest and lowest levels of economic benefit achieved. So first of all, we have a scenario where there wasn't any overall economic advantage over maintaining the status quo Romney flock. So this was occurring with the breed-specific lambing rate. So the Merino crossbred flocks weren't producing as many lambs, and with the lower selection intensity where we saw there were those large reductions in operating profit during transition. And then in contrast, the greatest economic benefit was 26% greater than maintaining the status quo Romney flock. And this is with the higher lambing rates and the higher selection intensities. And of course, the one where you're focusing, or when you include that period after transition where you have a higher operating profit. So the greatest benefit was with the higher selection and longer transition. And that was also the scenario that had the smaller effect on the size of the beef herd, on the proportion of feed that they were eating. There was some analysis done in 1990 in New Zealand looking at farming merinos in the North Island, and they compared buying capital merino stock in with like a 5-year transition versus introducing merino genetics more slowly, such as a 15-year transition that they did, and they found the longer transition had a greater net present value than the shorter transition, so similar to what I found. So a few discussion points from my papers. With the base Romney flock, the proportion of sheep enterprise income that was from the sale of wool was 11%, and then there was an average of 27% for among the scenarios that I did with the second cross merino flock. So it has the potential to diversify farm income. The health issues of farming these merino crossbreds in the North Island are still uncertain, as are the lambing rates that might be achieved. Those were 2 things where there was not a lot of data. It's still unknown. There was that significant effect on the beef herd size, with them producing a smaller proportion of feed during transition. And I assumed that the beef enterprise cash operating surplus was stable, so it only differed in its contribution to total farm cash operating surplus according to its proportion of the effective feed or farm area that it accounted for, but it's quite likely it would change with that extent or that level of change in feed. And this would have effects on pasture quality on these farms, which would affect production, which have not been included. There are options to further reduce wool fibre diameter beyond the point to which I went, either through continuing using merino sires rather than using, I've assumed you used a sire with a similar wool fibre diameter and just kept it constant, or continuing to select amongst your lambs for wool fibre diameter, but this might have further implications for production of having that tend to come with finer wool. So in conclusion, I've identified that a whole flock breed transition might take 7 to 10 years of crossbreeding, and that the crossbred ewe lamb selection intensity has a large influence. This is on feed demand and operating profit and the overall economic benefit of a breed transition. And I've also identified some potential levels of selection intensity that might be appropriate. And although the cash operating surplus was always higher post-transition than the base Romney level, it was lower during transition, and so low as to potentially affect farmers' ability to service their debt. The greatest overall economic benefit was achieved with a higher selection intensity of crossbred ewe lambs and a longer transition period. Thank you to my supervisors, the farmers and New Zealand Merino staff that advised me, and to the funders, including especially NZRS, who gave me the postgrad award for this conference this year. Thank you.
Okay.